Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. We're so glad you're here. Today is episode 113, Friday, July 15th. Hope your summer is going really well. As you know, this whole year, 2022, we've been focused on walking through the life of new product development. We started all the way back at academic research and then early stage funding. We talked about how do you know if you have the right market. This summer, we decided to focus in on questions surrounding de-risking. We're going to be going back in the fall to bigger questions of investing and things like that, venture capitalists and manufacturers. But right now, we're focused in on de-risking. How do you get the risk out of your startup, out of your product development effort? So today, week 4 of this series, we're going to be talking about the vehicle that is iterations. Not something people often like to talk about, but it's necessary and they're going to happen. How do you plan where they're going to happen? How do you get them to happen in places that are useful for your effort? We'll talk a little bit about design requirements and a little bit about design for manufacturing, just as examples of places where iterations happen and have to happen and should happen, but you want to know where they're coming so that you can order things in a good way. Before we get there, though, let's talk about saving the date, and that is September 20th of this year. Tuesday, September 20th in Kalamazoo, Michigan. MishBio is hosting the Michigan Medical Device Summit. Always a great event. I don't think we've had it since 2019 because of COVID, but we'll be looking forward to seeing you there in Kalamazoo, Michigan on September 20th. And so to the series, De-risking Medical Device Development. We've been going, this is our 4th week. We will continue for a number of weeks here on this topic. But we started all of this by saying, what is de-risking? What does that even mean? Why should we apply that term, which is not an industry term per se in medical device or in FDA, but it is a familiar business term. Why should we apply it more broadly as we think about how we develop medical devices? Well, here's what the Oxford English Dictionary says about de-risking. It's to make something safer by reducing the possibility that something bad will happen and that money will be lost. Actually, I think that applies pretty well to most medical device development projects. That's really the goal. A bunch of money is going to be spent, a bunch of time. Got to make sure that there's a return on that investment. So de-risking goes hand in hand with getting a return on your investment. So we think it's a pretty important way to think about the development process. And as we've said in previous weeks, de-risking is infused. It's not applied like some kind of a technique that you do, you walk in, you walk out, and then suddenly everything's better. It's something that has to permeate the culture. In a previous week, we talked about the similarities between the idea of quality and of de-risking, and it was Edward Deming himself, the father of quality, who said that the quality department shouldn't exist. We could say the same thing about de-risking. De-risking needs to be infused in all parts of your development program. If people really understood what it meant to take the risk out, they would all embrace it. And so that's why we're talking about it. It's not something that can just be applied. You smash the banana, you don't get what you're looking for, but maybe if you gently cut it up, you can get to where you want to be. Now, before we dive into today's part of the topic, I think it's important to remind you of our lesson from the woodshed. See, a couple months ago, some of my kids and I went on a service project. And while 9 women can't make a baby in 1 month, it is true that 20 people can move 2 tons of wood faster than 10 people can. Now, why do we say that? Why does that matter? Well, there is a limit to de-risking. Sometimes the right solution is to pour the money and the effort and the time on. Sometimes you can get there from here. And that's what's really important to recognize too. De-risking is only a technique to get you to a point of action. That point of action is actually what matters. And de-risking is just to know whether applying action at this moment in time is going to have the desired effect. So we don't want to forget this lesson from the woodshed. We need to understand the whole goal of any of these thought processes is to get to a point where we can actually take action and do something in a lean, efficient manner. So that's the lesson from the woodshed. Now, prior sessions, this is session 4 of this part of the series. If you scan those QR codes, you can get to the prior sessions 1, 2, and 3. But in prior sessions, we talked more about what de-risking is. We talked about when does it apply, and of course the answer is kind of all the way through the development process. We talked about some interesting frameworks like Cynefin for sense making. How do you know where you are and whether you are where you think you are? We'll talk a little bit more about that again today, as we often do. We talked about design controls recently as a vehicle for de-risking. If you truly understand design controls, you'll understand that the reason they exist is a method to get risk out of products if they're used correctly. So design controls continues to be an important part of the de-risking, aka development process for medical devices. Now last week we talked all about regulatory strategy and how to de-risk your regulatory process. And a big part of that is how do you talk to FDA about your ideas? Now some have said don't give them rope to hang you. Well, that's not quite right either, because you do need to give them enough to help you evaluate. But it turns out there are very specific ways to talk to the agency, to communicate your ideas so that you don't open up new loose ends. The whole point of de-risking is to reduce the loose ends. It's to reduce the chaos. And so it probably helps us to go back to our favorite framework, the Cynefin framework for sense making, to help to understand where we are in a process. We don't want to be living in a chaotic regime. That's just not a place we want to live as developers of medical devices. But oftentimes we find ourselves in the complex or the complicated domain. Now just a reminder, Cynefin is not a framework that we've invented here at Into Being, or even one that's widely applied in the medical device development space, but it should be. It was invented by Dave Snowden while he was at IBM, and he continues at Cognitive Edge to pursue this framework. This graphic here was created by Martin Berg from the website that you see there. But we find it an invaluable framework for thinking about how to get the risk out of things. You have to understand what part of the framework you're in before you can ever get to what would be considered a clear domain. Clear domains are the things of work instructions and checklists. And while we'd like to be there, the reality is that projects don't start there. You got to get there as quickly as you can. So just a reminder of that sense-making framework that we'll be constantly referring back to. Also, just a refresher on design controls. If you look at the early stages of design controls, the intended use of the product drives so much. The user needs of the product drive so much of downstream development. The risks associated with the product code, the standards, like international consensus standards that FDA recognizes that relate to your product, these all matter because as they get placed into design input requirements, they can lead and structure the later parts of product development. And they give a framework for going back and verifying as well as validating that later product development. Now, not to steal the thunder later, but doesn't this look a lot like a de-risking process like we talked about in a previous week? Doesn't it even look like an iterative process like we're going to be talking about today? Because the reality is we could have just said, what does our product need to do? But that would have belied the complexity underneath the differences between an intended use, user needs, risks, standards, and the lower level design input requirements. So even in a framework like this, we could ask the question, why does this help to de-risk? And part of the answer is because it gives us a framework for iteration. It gives us a logical, structured way to go through thoughts again and again, but not spinning our wheels, getting progressively closer to that answer. So let's talk specifically about iterations as a vehicle for de-risking in the medical device development process. I really want to talk very simply today. First about iterations, what they are, why they are, how do we define an iteration? And then just a few examples in the world of requirements definition. And then very, very briefly at the end, I want to talk about design for manufacturing and how iterations play into that concept. Now you may wonder, why did we pick requirements definition and design for manufacturing as places to draw examples from for iterations? That doesn't quite make sense, does it? Well, I think you'll see that it actually makes a lot of sense when you look at the basic definition of what an iteration is. And we don't need an industry-specific definition here. This one from Merriam-Webster. An iteration is a procedure in which repetition of a sequence of operations yields results successively closer to a desired result. Successively closer to a desired result. Now, if that sounds anything like making a statue, cutting it out of a block of marble, you'd be right, because as you iterate on that, it gets closer and closer to what is underneath, what the artist sees in their eye, which is the statue of David, for example. But there's another thing I want you to notice about this definition, and that is on both sides of the words successively closer. First it says yields results that are successively closer to a desired result. Well, this is interesting because it actually drives us to the two topics we do want to talk about today. Because when we say it yields results in the world of medical device development, that actually means a manufacturable design. It means your design history file and your device master record. It means something that you are ready to go with. It means something that is ready to be submitted to FDA. But successively closer to a desired result, what is that desired result? Well, again, in the world of medical devices, those are your requirements. Those are all of your design input requirements, your user needs, and everything else that's driving this process. So right there, we already see that the very definition of iterations contains these two endpoints. It's where did you start with the requirements? What are you trying to get to? And what is that finished result? And so DFM, designed for manufacturing, this place of, are we almost there? Are we almost ready to build this? And the design input requirements actually form a wonderful bookend for this discussion of iterations. So that's why our examples are DFM and requirements definition. Maybe we could phrase it a different way also. MedTech iteration is revisiting and redoing something before product launch. Now, if that doesn't sound very appetizing, I understand why. And we can ask ourselves this question: is this a good thing? Or is this a bad thing? And as you saw from the basic definition of an iteration, successively closer to the desired result, we might just say that it's a necessary thing. We're kidding ourselves if we think that we can go all the way from point A to point Z, skipping everything in between. But it does beg the question, how do you know what you have to do? How do you know how many iterations are necessary? Why would we sit here and spin our wheels if that iteration wasn't necessary? How do you ever right-size that? And we'll talk about that. But for now, let's at least recognize that iterations are something that you do have to plan on. But how do you plan on them? How do you know when they need to happen? In fact, why is it that we can't just get it right the first time? So here's a dartboard, and you see that one dart is in the center of the dartboard. And you think to yourself, well, I hit that. I got that one right in the middle. Doesn't that show that I don't need iterations? Well, those of you who've played darts for fun know that sometimes you miss the dartboard entirely and it hits that door and somebody gets mad. And sometimes you hit the dartboard and it's nowhere near the center. And over the course of an evening and you're having fun with your friends, or maybe it's tomahawk throwing. We did that recently with some colleagues. You get closer and closer to that center point and you feel good about it. And you think, this is great. I'm getting closer. But that's not playing to win. Playing to win in darts involves getting as many of those darts, however many are in the hand, as close to the center point as possible. And in fact, if you don't do it successfully, you're not going to win. Not just one of them, not just feeling good that you got close to the center, but all of them. You know, the same is true for the great game of bowling. Bowling for fun or profit, we entitle this section of the show. But the reality is, you know, those of us who go out bowling on an evening, we feel pretty good if we get a few strikes. But then the more you play it, the more you think, wow, you know, I'm mostly, you know, half of those were strikes. And then you go a little bit further and you go further and further. But if you want to be competitive, you're going to have to make sure that almost every single frame is a strike. And what we're starting to realize as we talk about this is that it's not enough to say, hey, I did something good once. I have to do it consistently. I also like to refer to this as the artist problem. Now, as some of you know, I have a number of kids. I love all my kids, and it's always fun to watch them develop. Right now, we're going to analogize the growth of an artist to the process of development. Now, there are some very, very important differences, and those of you who are in the medical device development industry will immediately see those differences. So bear with me for just a minute while we go through this as an analogy. And those of you who have kids know that it's fun to watch your kids as they get that first crayon or colored pencil and hopefully a piece of paper or maybe the wall. One of the most creative solutions for that is to put the frame around the wall and just leave it, because sometimes it's easier that way. And the kinds of scribbles that emerge can't really be called art. They're just scribbles on the paper, and we treasure them as parents, but we know that they don't really represent anything except for learning. They do represent learning for this budding young artist. And then they reach that wonderful stage where something emerges off that paper from the very same crayons, and we look at it and we say, wow, you're actually trying to make art. You're actually trying to put these ideas together. That's great. That's wonderful. And we might even save that. We might even, oh, this is the first time little Susie drew a car. That's great. From there, that day comes where the child is drawing like crazy. Things emerge and you're amazed by what they have created. Till eventually the day comes and you realize that their work was featured on the cover of the school magazine, or they made an album cover for their friends, and now they're really making useful art. They're actually creating something that's useful. Maybe if they go on, someday they're at the Met and they're famous and their art is known and coveted the world over. Now, if you're listening to that iteration series there, and you're saying to yourself, well, I would never hire a child to make my medical device. Well, that's good. I hope you wouldn't. I hope you would hire someone with experience. I hope you would hire someone, if we used an analogy, that made useful art, or that was a Met qualified artist. That would be the right choice. But we bring this analogy to make one very simple point. Was this an example of iterations? Or was it an example of something else? The reality is, how many iterations was that I just took you through? Well, the answer is 5. That was 5 iterations. Because this budding young artist made one iteration per, quote, product launch. Now, it's true that it's only the later product launches that we would have cared about, the ones that were useful or that made them famous. But the reality is that this artist had the luxury of sitting in their studio or their bedroom, whichever it was, depending on how old they were, and creating something essentially in a vacuum. And so there was really only one iteration per product launch. That's a luxury that distinguishes the artistic community from the development community. This is something that doesn't happen in engineering, because rarely do we have the luxury of sitting somewhere and saying, I'm going to come up with something, and whatever I come up with is going to be good enough. There were scribbles. There was the first intentional art. And there was the budding artist. And there was the useful artist. And there was the Met qualified artist. Free from this reality that interdependencies create iterations. This is something that's often overlooked. But as techniques emerge, techniques like the design control process, frameworks like the Cynefin framework, we start to realize and embody in things like best practices, realizations of places where interdependencies need to create iterations, and so we account for them without guilt, without shame, and just realize that they are part of the planning process. And that's part of the goal, is to realize where interdependencies create necessary iterations. Now again, we have to realize that the whole goal of medical device development is to get there quickly and efficiently, to not miss a market that is emerging and that we can capitalize on. So one more iteration that is necessary is completely not okay. What we're talking about here is, how do you find out if it is necessary? And if you do need to account for it, rather than being surprised by it later, because that's often what happens if we're honest. We're often surprised by an iteration that we didn't know was there, that we didn't want to see happen. Here's how it works in our heads, right? Activity A and activity B and activity C, they all result in a product. And that would be delightful. That's why we hire good people to do good work in activity A and activity B and activity C. But it's a mistake to think that by turning everybody loose, you're going to end up with a product. Because we know in our heads and in our hearts that this is going to result in an iterative process that, even at its most simple, probably looks more like this. Activity A, activity B, activity C. Not product, but iteration 1, which then feeds back into activity A, activity B, activity C. And that leads to iteration 2. So this kind of process that we have to be ready for. This is why, especially when people go outside of their team and they try to hire a development firm or some development partner or a manufacturer, they try to get everything in there. They say, this is everything we need from you. Well, of course it's not everything we need from you. There's no way it could be everything we need from you, because it's only through this process of iteration that you ever discover the things that are truly necessary. Now, that's not to say we don't want to hire the MET qualified developers. We don't want to hire the useful developers. We're not going to hire the person scribbling in their bedroom. But the reality is, even so, the interdependencies create the need for iterations. And if you take no other point away today, that's probably it. That interdependencies create the need for iterations. And you need to know where those are going to come and where they're going to hit. You have to have a strategy that says, not this is how it's going to happen, but rather this is where we're going to get to the next inflection point that's going to answer a question that tells us what the rest of our process is going to look like. Now, it's always fun to reinvent the wheel, to reinvent solutions. And you can stop here and think to yourself, oh yeah, this is the problem. What if we knew the requirements? If we had something, maybe we could call it design controls. Well, that'd be great. It's already there. We should definitely use it. What if we actually spent some time thinking about how to design it all to go together, if we thought about what the manufacturer's needs were so that we could address them and we could make sure that everything comes together in the end? That's a great idea. Well, we would be reinventing the wheel. It's important to just recognize that those techniques do exist. Without these, it's like we're scribbling with crayons in our bedroom. We aren't the useful artist and we're not the MET artist. But these by themselves are not sufficient. They're not a recipe that instantly results in success, in de-risking. We haven't completely de-risked simply by saying, we're going to follow design controls, or we're going to do DFM. What's more here is that we have to realize that these iterations are created by interdependencies. Remember this, we said before, iteration is repetition that yields results. That's our product designed for manufacturing. Making it successively closer to a desired result, which is our requirements? Well, let's talk about each of these. We're going to talk about requirements first for just a minute. You might even ask, why have requirements? And I think the answer that most people will give is actually the wrong one. They'll say this: you need to have requirements so you know what to do. Well, that's interesting, but we call that catalog engineering. It does happen and it's important. But if I just tell you, do this and put that there, I've done the design. I haven't actually told you what is truly a requirement, right? A requirement is more to know when you've succeeded. It assumes that there's design work that needs to be done, that something has to be figured out and implemented. And the requirement tells you when you've succeeded. That sounds an awful lot like something that we like to call a test, which is why we like to talk about test-driven requirements or test-driven development. Because if you can understand what you would actually test, the very minute you write that requirement, you are so far ahead of the game. It's not worth writing a requirement that you don't know how you would test it. What makes a bad requirement? Well, a requirement that doesn't matter to product success. Now you say, why would anyone write a requirement that doesn't matter to the success of their product? Well, probably because someone told them to. Someone said, FDA expects you to have design input requirements. Go write the requirements for the product. But if that thing that I write down isn't testable and it doesn't matter for the success of the product, I'm completely wasting time. This is not useful for my iterative process. It's simply a time waster because now it's going to have to be verified later on. For example, if I say that the product needs to be red because I think the color red is a highly visible color. Well, I may find out later that maybe it wasn't the most visible color in all situations, and maybe a color like a high visibility green is actually much more visible. But I shouldn't say even then that the requirement is that the product be green. I should say that the requirement is that the product be visible to this type of user, in this type of lighting, in this type of situation. That's an example of requirements that are useful. How would you test it? Well, the test for a red product is to go look at it and say, is it red? That's not very useful most of the time. But the requirement for a product that is visible is to take users and to put them in an environment and say, can you see this in a way that's meaningful and matters? So does the requirement matter to product success? In the case that I just gave you, the requirement that it's red actually doesn't matter to product success. But a requirement that it be visible does matter to product success. Also, if it can't be meaningfully tested, it's a bad requirement. So what are good requirements? Well, it's ones that do matter to product success and that can be meaningfully tested. And this is tremendously important. When you sit down and you say, with your internal team, when you sit down with vendors and you say, what are our requirements? I don't want to say it this way, but I'm going to say it this way. Most of the time, what comes back are not truly requirements. Most of the time, what comes back are a mix of design solutions that some part of the group thinks are a good idea. And rarely are they distinguished needs that, if they're met, are going to mean success. Now, you can't always guarantee that. That's part of why this is an iterative process. Because sometimes you discover things along the way. And this is why requirements are and need to be iterative, and why they're a valuable vehicle for iteration. Because as development proceeds, you sometimes discover that requirements are missing. Sometimes you discover that requirements can't be met as planned. And the reality is, if we're doing test-driven development and test-driven requirements, you've got to know that these are going to become meaningfully testable requirements when you're done. You're not going to get through verification. You're not going to get through validation. You're not going to satisfy the FDA if you don't come up with meaningful tests that address something that's going to make your product successful. But you don't know these at the outset always. Some you do, some you don't. Some you will discover along the way. And this is why requirements definition is actually a wonderful, wonderful vehicle when used properly for making iterations in a healthy way. Remember Edison and his light bulb filament? I tried 4,000 things that don't work. He actually had to get them and try them. He actually had to iterate in order to get to something that was going to make him successful. Now, we might argue that that's the chaotic domain of the Cynefin framework. That's not where we want to be for product development. Most of the time, we do not want to be sitting there testing 4,000 things in hopes that one works. That is far too early stage for true product development to be occurring. But the principle still holds. Those iterations are necessary to the process of discovery that is inherent in development of any stage. Sometimes we don't know what won't work until we try it. The question is, how do you get there as quickly as possible? Well, since we're talking about requirements, there are native hierarchies built into FDA's expectation for requirements. There are different types of requirements that FDA does call out. At very least, there are user needs and technical requirements. In fact, there can be many more than that when you think about the types of risk analysis that happens under standards and mitigations that pop out of that process. There's many other aspects relating to usability, yet slightly nuanced and different from user needs and technical requirements. But even if we just look at these and acknowledge that under technical requirements, most of the time we have system requirements as well as subsystem requirements, we start to discover that, maybe breaking these down into different categories isn't such a bad idea because it buys us inherent iterations in our thought process. It allows us to identify that these things can be built up in a certain way, and that doesn't mean that the interactions at the higher levels won't create some hurdles we need to jump. But at a very basic level, we could all acknowledge that if I want to go out there and develop a product and I put people on subsystem number 1, they start to work on it, they're working on iteration 1, even if everybody's working in parallel on all their different subsystems. So we see at least one iteration here. But then, when we start to think about it at a system level, until those subsystems are done, we don't really know if we're there yet. And when they finally encounter each other, we can discover that there's another iteration that's happening. But even then, we're talking at a technical level. We're building things that we can test at a bench level. We haven't really survived encounter with the most important person, who's the customer. And that's where bridging to user needs, final finished medical devices tested under working conditions, that's where that matters. And that can often prompt an iteration right there. So when we ask the question, how many iterations should you expect for medical device development? Well, I can't tell you that, and I wouldn't want to tell you it's 5, or it's 6, or it's 7. But I can tell you that if you just look at the basic number of types of requirements that the industry recognizes, you're likely to have 2 or 3. We can say that pretty safely. Now, that being said, it's important that you look at your actual project. None of this is meant to be a rule of thumb to say, oh, it's always going to be this, but rather to focus you on the reality that interdependencies create iterations. Remember our example of an artist. An artist usually, when working alone, has the luxury of going into their studio or their bedroom with their crayons and coming out with something that satisfies them. And we think, ooh, something got created, this is wonderful. But the difference between that and actual medical device development is so large and the interdependencies so staggering as to be uncomparable. Because these interdependencies create the need for iterations. If you're working on a small team and you can handle it all internally, and your communication is good, your number of iterations is likely to be smaller. If you do it in a large team with many, many moving parts, wow, maybe you can do it with fewer iterations, but it takes a lot more work to make sure something isn't dropped. So we use the techniques that are available to us, we use the best practices, we use design controls to buy as many inherent iterations as possible, while recognizing that every new layer of complexity, every new layer of interdependence creates a point where an iteration is likely to happen. Where did that new vendor come in that you do need but didn't need until now? Where did that new clinical partner come in that you knew you were going to need but you didn't need until now? All of these things create the potential for iterations. Now, we mentioned manufacturing, and this brings us to the point of design for manufacturing. And we're only going to say a little bit about this because so much of it is really a design question, right? It's a requirements question. It's a did we understand what was needed? But it's important to recognize that when you're talking about design for manufacturability, oftentimes you are late stage in the process. Things have begun to harden. If we acknowledged some of the iterations that had happened before, and we talked about them in design for terms, well, sometimes we design for concept. Oh, well, management needs something to think about what this product could be. Cool, we made some pictures. That's an iteration at some level. And there's design for demonstration. So maybe we printed some 3D printed prototypes, grabbed an Arduino and wired something up. Or maybe we did a design for a trial, first in human trial. Well, sterilized parts, maybe they're hand built, but this is getting pretty complex. We're getting up there and things are starting to get solidified, starting to get hardened. When we really get to true design for manufacturing, getting ready for products that can be built as manufacturing representatives so that we can do something like validation of our product. We're going to need CAD files, we're going to need tolerance prints, we're going to need interactions with the specific vendors. So you can see we've already iterated to get to this point where we're ready to take this final level of hardening. And iteration gets driven in design for manufacturability by questions like, who could build it? How could they build it? What are the implications for the device when they build it, as opposed to us building it? Will the device work after many are built? These are tolerance type questions. You know, a client came to us one time and had a vendor for their primary part, making a diagnostic. And they had a vendor, and the vendor was able to produce things. In fact, the vendor was able to produce things that they needed because they couldn't have produced them themselves. Well, that's great. Iteration one, hey, we're seeing things that from a demo standpoint are doing what we want. We're so excited about that. But then the design for manufacturability questions started to come in hot and heavy. And it turned out that this vendor, even though they could do some early things, couldn't do many of the later things. Or many of the questions that were raised during design for manufacturability led back upstream. They shoved things all the way back upstream. So DFM itself can be a driver to shove things back further than you would like, which is why it's important to think about, have we thought about design for manufacturability as opposed to upfront requirements? It's very hard to do DFM strictly from upfront requirements. Oftentimes you have to encounter the manufacturer, you have to try it out, see what's happening at a pilot level. That means iterations. That means trying things, finding out what did and didn't work, and hopefully not kicking it so far back up the chain that you set yourself way back. I want to tell you about what we're going to call the peg in the hole project. You all played with it. I don't know why we're on kids' toys and crayons today, but that's just where we went. Y'all remember that toy where you got to put the peg through the hole. And we can analogize product development to that, especially if you're working in teams and one team is designing the peg and the other team is designing the hole. Now, of course, for reasons that are obvious, I won't mention what the pegs and what the holes are in this case. But here's the reality. Situations occur where Team A is designing the peg and Team B is designing the hole. And let's say that Team B is a little bit ahead of this. We're past concept development. We're well into development. Some are still working on functionality. Have you ever heard that in a project? Oh, we're still working on functionality. We've just got to optimize it. It's always a warning sign. But Team B is a little bit ahead of Team A. They've actually done design for manufacturing of the hole, the thing that the peg goes into. They've actually gone so far as to create detailed toleranced drawings. They know how this is going to be manufactured. They're ready to pull the trigger. They're ready to order everything that's necessary for the hole. Team A hasn't quite gotten there yet. They know they've got to do design for manufacturability. And you know how we said a minute ago that design for manufacturability, while you want good minds in the room, you want to know as much as possible, but it's rare that you can predict every requirement around DFM. It really is something that you have to talk about early, talk about throughout, and then you got to try it on test runs and find out, is this going to work? But what if it hasn't been addressed at all? What if somebody forgets to think about DFM? What if somebody forgets that we're going to hit this and we better be thinking about this throughout, addressing those questions as early as possible? What if Team A hadn't done that, but then suddenly got to that point and said, oh no, the peg is wrong. Sure, the peg works. Sure, the peg is satisfactory to the user in all ways, except it can't be manufactured. What happens then? Well, Team A might think to themselves, we just have to tell Team B to make a bigger hole. But remember, Team B is at a point where Team B is basically already has the hole. Is it really that simple for them to just flip a switch and have that change? This is where DFM comes in, because if DFM has been performed, if it's mature, if it's something that is there, it's not as easy to back up. So as things solidify, it actually creates a problem at the other end of the spectrum from the requirements side. And what has to happen next, we just described this, but here's a Team B into mature DFM, mature design for manufacturing. Team A was not at that stage. Probably could have been, but wasn't. Team B got called back to iterate again. So iterations emerged from an immature and unbalanced design for manufacturing process because Team A bumped into DFM issues when Team B was already mature in that regard. So what happens at that point, and this is what nobody wants to hear, right? That stage of DFM, it got pushed out. Now, it wasn't where we thought it was. We thought we were through it for Team A, and Team B just needs to catch up. But what we find out is that because Team A had not done it, Team A has now made Team B go backwards. They have to start back over from a large part of the design. Now, Team A is also going to have to catch up. Hopefully, they've thought about it all at this point. But this is an example, first of all, from the requirements side, and then from the DFM side, how at both ends of the scale, iterations can emerge. The goal is to know what the iterations are, to be able to predict them. Some of them are so predictable as to be ensconced in things like design controls. But some of the iterations emerge, well, emergently, but there are still ways that we can predict that they're coming, and DFM at the far end of the scale is a way that you can have a sense that if this hasn't been done, you may find yourself backing up further than you expected. So hopefully these are some useful ways for you to think about the world of iterations. Can't tell you how many iterations are in your project that you're working on. But as you think about the fact that interdependencies create iterations, I hope that it'll help you ponder what you should be trying to predict in the future as it comes down the road. So in summary, iterations can be a blessing if planned or a curse if not. Requirements definition can help with iterations, or it can hurt if you're not thinking about it holistically. And design for manufacturing can help with iterations, or it can hurt if the entire team isn't synced in where they are in the process. As always, we'd like to thank Unsplash.com for many of the pictures that we used in today's presentation. You can scan any of those QR codes to see the images and their authors, and there's a few more speaking of art. Well, that's about it for today. Next week, we're going to be talking more about the world of standards and their use in the world of de-risking. Thanks for being with us on MedTech Crossroads. We'll see you next week.